The two-headed duckling remained a constant presence in Emma's mind, its strange, unsettling form haunting her thoughts. Since its birth, it hadn't moved much, just stood there in the corner of the barn, its two heads swaying ever so slightly, its eyes wide and unblinking. Emma would visit it every morning, offering food and water, but it didn't respond. It didn't eat, it didn't chirp. It was as though it existed in a state of limbo, neither fully alive nor fully gone. Something about it felt unnatural, and yet Emma couldn't bring herself to turn away. She knew, deep down, that it wasn't just the duckling that was suffering. It was the land, the farm, their entire way of life. The duckling seemed to carry the weight of it all, its strange condition mirroring the disruption that had slowly seeped into every corner of their world. Chapter 1. An unusual morning. It was an ordinary morning in the small town of Brookfield, where life moved at its own pace, wrapped in the gentle rhythm of nature. The sun had just risen above the hills, casting a warm glow over the countryside. The air was crisp and fresh, carrying the scent of dew on the grass. The distant caw of a crow echoed in the quiet, and the sounds of birds chirping harmonized with the rustling of leaves. In this peaceful world, John and Emma were already up, ready to begin another day on their small farm. John was in the kitchen, sipping his morning tea as he gazed out the window, watching the mist slowly lift off the fields. At 72, his hair had turned silver, and his hands, though weathered by years of hard work, still held the strength of a man who had spent his life caring for the land. Emma, his wife of 50 years, was already bustling around the house. At 70, she had a sprightly energy that defied her age. Her silver hair was pinned up in a neat bun, and her gentle blue eyes reflected the wisdom and kindness she had gained over the years. They lived on a small farm, surrounded by animals and the simple pleasures of rural life. Their days revolved around feeding their livestock, tending to their garden, and taking care of their chickens, pigs, ducks, rabbits, and cows. Emma's love for the animals was evident in every task she performed, from the careful way she brushed the cows to the tender manner in which she handled the delicate eggs the hens laid every morning. As John finished his tea, he got up from his chair, his joints creaking as he moved. He grabbed his boots from the corner of the room, his movements deliberate but sure. Emma was already out the door, calling for him. "John, could you check on the ducks this morning? The eggs are starting to hatch," she called, her voice warm and inviting. John nodded, adjusting his hat as he stepped outside. The farm was quiet except for the sounds of the animals waking up. The pigs were grunting in their pens, the rabbits were nibbling on fresh hay, and the geese were honking in their usual noisy manner. John smiled as he walked toward the small pond where the ducks lived. It was an old wooden structure, weathered by time, but still sturdy enough to serve its purpose. The ducks had made it their home, and every spring, Emma would eagerly anticipate the arrival of new ducklings. As he approached, he noticed the ducks were gathered near one of the nests. Emma had been keeping a close eye on the eggs, and it seemed that the day had finally come for them to hatch. He crouched down beside the nest, careful not to disturb the mother duck, who was sitting protectively on her clutch of eggs. John could hear the faint sound of peeping from within the eggs, a sure sign that something exciting was about to happen. Emma joined him a moment later, her hands resting gently on her hips as she watched the scene unfold. Her eyes sparkled with excitement. "Look, John, they're coming." At that moment, one of the eggs cracked open, revealing the tiny beak of a duckling. Slowly, it pushed its way out, its soft feathers still damp from the egg. The little creature blinked its eyes as it took its first breaths of air. Emma smiled, her heart swelling with joy. "Another one," she whispered, "just like last year. They're always so precious." John nodded, his eyes softening as he watched the duckling wobble on its tiny legs, looking up at its mother. "They're a miracle every time," he agreed, his voice hushed with reverence. As more eggs began to crack open, Emma leaned forward, her gaze fixed on the unfolding scene. But then, something caught her attention. A small, subtle shift in the movement of one of the eggs. It didn't crack the way the others did. Instead, it seemed to bulge out, as if something was trying to push its way through in a strange, unnatural way. "John, look at that one," Emma said, her voice laced with curiosity. John turned his attention to the egg Emma had pointed out. It was trembling slightly, as if the little creature inside was struggling to break free. He watched carefully, sensing that something was different. The egg cracked open with a sharp, uneven sound, and John's brow furrowed as he leaned in closer to inspect it. Inside, there was not one duckling, but two, both connected at the neck by a single body, each with a tiny head looking out in opposite directions. John's heart skipped a beat. He blinked, unsure if he was seeing things correctly. "Emma," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You have to see this." Emma knelt beside him, her eyes wide with shock. She reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing the two-headed duckling. The tiny creatures were alive, their soft feathers glistening in the morning light, but they were undeniably unusual. Two heads, one body. It was a miracle of nature, but also a mystery. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stared at the little creature, wondering what this strange occurrence meant for their farm and their lives. Emma's heart swelled with concern and awe. "It's a double-headed duckling," she whispered, almost to herself. "What do we do?" John scratched his chin, deep in thought. He had seen many strange things in his life, weather anomalies, unusual crops, and the quirks of animals, but never something like this. A two-headed duck was something out of the ordinary, even in their little corner of the world. "We'll need to take good care of it, that's for sure," John said, his voice steady, but with a hint of uncertainty. "It's a sign, Emma. A sign that something is changing." Emma nodded, her hand still hovering over the tiny creature. It was as though she could feel the weight of its existence, the responsibility of caring for such an unusual life. As they both watched the duckling try to take its first steps, their minds raced with questions. How would they care for it? Could it survive? Would it be able to live a normal life? Or would it require special attention? And what about the other animals? How would they react to this strange new arrival? The peaceful morning that had begun with the usual rhythm of farm life had suddenly shifted into something entirely different. The farm, which had always been a place of quiet routine and contentment, was now at the center of an unexpected mystery, and neither John nor Emma knew what would come next. With a final glance at the two-headed duckling, Emma reached down and gently scooped it up in her hands. "We'll figure it out," she said, her voice firm but filled with love. "We always do." John watched her, feeling a surge of affection for his wife. They had weathered many storms together in their long life, and he knew that no matter what challenges the strange duckling would bring, they would face them together, just as they had always done. "Let's get it settled," John said, offering a reassuring smile, "and then we'll check on the others. The pigs and the cows won't wait forever." But as they headed back to the house, both of them couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Something was stirring in the world around them, something beyond their understanding. And for the first time in many years, they both felt a spark of unease, mixed with excitement, at the thought of what lay ahead. Chapter 2. Two Heads, One Fate. The day passed slowly after the unexpected discovery of the two-headed duckling. The morning had been filled with uncertainty, yet there was something about the little creature that tugged at John and Emma's hearts. Despite the strange appearance, it was still a duckling, fragile, innocent, and full of potential. And for all its oddity, it had a life to live. John and Emma worked through their usual chores in a daze, the image of the duckling never far from their minds. Emma found herself glancing over at the ducks more frequently than usual, and John's steps seemed heavy as he moved about the farm, occasionally pausing to look over at the small enclosure where the mother duck and her brood were. He couldn't shake the sense of unease that settled deep in his gut. The duckling was alive, yes, but what kind of life would it have? That evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of purple and orange, John found himself back in the barn, inspecting the animals. He could hear the familiar sounds of the cows chewing on hay and the occasional grunt from the pigs. But his mind kept returning to the strange event of the day, the two-headed duckling. It was a quiet puzzle that wouldn't leave him alone. He had heard of rare birth defects in animals before, but nothing like this. Emma had decided to stay inside and prepare supper, but she had insisted they keep a close eye on the little duckling. "Let's make sure it's feeding well," she said, her voice filled with an unspoken concern. "It's important it stays strong, John. We don't know what it means yet, but it's our responsibility." John had agreed, though he didn't quite know what kind of responsibility they were talking about. As he stood there in the barn, a heavy thought entered his mind. Could it survive, or would it need to be put down? How long could it live, sharing a single body with another head? And how would the other animals react to such a bizarre creature? He paused in front of the stall where the duckling rested. It lay nestled in the straw, the two heads resting next to each other. His tiny beaks occasionally opened in tandem, searching for food. The sight was both fascinating and unsettling. Two lives sharing one body, one set of wings, and one heart. The little creature was already so different from the others, and yet it tried so hard to fit in, to be like every other duckling. John couldn't help but wonder if it was possible for something so unnatural to thrive in the world he had always known. He gently knelt down beside the duckling, careful not to startle it. His calloused hands trembled slightly as he reached out to offer some feed. As he did, the two heads turned toward him at the same time, their tiny eyes wide with curiosity. "Come on now," John muttered softly to himself, shaking his head in disbelief. "What do you need?" The duckling opened its mouths, but only one head could get to the food at a time. The other head pulled back, then reached forward again, vying for a share. John watched with a mixture of awe and concern. It seemed like the two heads fought for control, but at the same time, they worked in tandem, as though they knew they had to cooperate in order to survive. "Emma, come take a look at this," John called out, his voice steady, but filled with wonder. Emma appeared in the doorway of the barn moments later, a lantern in hand. Her face softened as she saw John kneeling beside the duckling. She walked over, her eyes immediately drawn to the tiny creature. "Still fighting for food, aren't they?" she said with a quiet laugh. "It's like they don't know what to do with each other." "Poor thing," John nodded, rubbing his chin. "I'm not sure how long it'll last, Emma. It doesn't seem natural. What if something happens to one of them?" Emma crouched beside him, her eyes fixed on the two-headed duckling. She reached out and gently stroked its feathers, her hand trembling ever so slightly. "We have to try, John. We've never backed away from caring for something just because it's different. This little one is still alive, still needs us." John exhaled deeply. He had to admit she was right. Over the years, they had cared for all sorts of creatures. Sickly chickens, a pig with a broken leg, even a rabbit born with a malformed ear. But this felt different. It wasn't just the rarity of it. It was the challenge. But Emma's calm voice grounded him. She had always been the one who saw the heart of a situation, no matter how impossible it seemed. They spent the next few hours caring for the duckling, making sure it had enough to eat and drink. It was a slow, meticulous process. John and Emma took turns feeding the two-headed creature, offering it small amounts of food at a time. Each head ate in turns, and though it seemed cumbersome, the duckling appeared to thrive. It waddled around awkwardly, but it didn't fall over. It didn't stumble like a sickly animal. There was a spark of life in it. As the evening drew to a close, John and Emma sat on the porch, sipping their tea as they watched the sky darken. The night was filled with the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustling of the leaves. The air was still, but there was an undeniable tension in the world around them. They didn't speak much. Neither of them knew quite what to say. There was a heaviness in their hearts, a worry they couldn't quite shake. What did it mean that this little creature had been born in such a strange way? And what would happen next? "You think it'll be all right?" Emma asked, breaking the silence. John looked at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. He had always been the strong one, the one to solve problems and offer solutions. But this was beyond him. "I don't know, Emma, but we'll do what we can. It's all we can do." They sat in silence for a while, letting the weight of the day settle around them. Finally, John stood up and stretched, his old bones creaking as he did. "Well, we'll figure it out. We always do. But for now, Let's make sure the rest of the animals are taken care of. Emma nodded, her eyes still distant, as though her mind was somewhere else. She rose to her feet as well and followed John back to the barn, her thoughts full of questions she didn't know how to answer. All she knew was that the world had changed today, and there was no going back. The two-headed duckling was a symbol of something unknown, something that would challenge everything they had known about life on the farm. But for now, they would focus on what they could control, feeding, caring, and hoping. Because in the end, they knew that no matter how strange the world became, love and care would always be enough. Chapter 3. A Growing Mystery. The morning came early, as it always did at the farm. Emma woke up before the sun had fully risen, the soft light of dawn filtering through the window. The familiar quiet of the countryside filled her senses. Fresh air, distant birdsong, and the soft rustle of leaves as the wind began to stir. The farm had a comforting stillness in the early hours, before the world fully woke up. But today there was something different. The unease from the day before still lingered in the air, hanging over the farm like a dense fog. As Emma made her way to the kitchen to prepare breakfast, her thoughts immediately went to the two-headed duckling. She had spent most of the previous evening, after the sun had set, sitting by its side, watching it as it awkwardly flapped its wings and wobbled about. It had seemed strong enough, at least for now, but something still felt off. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something about the little creature wasn't just rare, it was wrong. She had known animals all her life, and nothing had ever quite perplexed her like this. John was already up when she entered the kitchen, his graying hair rumpled from sleep, his face lined with the wear of years of hard work. He sat at the table, slowly sipping his tea, his brow furrowed in thought. He looked up at Emma when she entered, his tired eyes reflecting the same uncertainty that plagued her own mind. "Morning, Emma," he said quietly, setting his cup down on the table. He reached for a loaf of bread that sat on the counter, cutting off a slice before buttering it. "Morning, John," Emma replied, her voice soft but tinged with worry. "How's the little one this morning?" John hesitated before answering. "Still seems all right. It's up and moving around more than last night, but it's strange. The way it eats, one head at a time, but not always in sync. I don't know what to make of it." Emma sat down beside him, the weight of the situation settling heavily on her shoulders. She stared out the window at the barn where the ducks were kept. The mother duck, despite being an attentive mother, was noticeably keeping her distance from the two-headed duckling. Emma had noticed the same thing the night before. While the other ducklings had nestled close to their mother, this one had remained apart. It was as if even the other animals sensed something different about it. "We need to figure out what's going on, John. I don't want to just watch it struggle," Emma said, her voice almost a whisper, as if afraid of speaking the truth aloud. John nodded, his expression grim. "I know, but what can we do? It's not like we can just ask someone about this. I've never seen anything like it." A long silence passed between them, filled only by the distant sounds of animals in the barn. After a moment, Emma stood up and crossed to the window. She looked out at the barn, her eyes narrowing slightly as she watched the animals moving about. There was something she hadn't told John. The unease she felt wasn't just about the duckling. It was something in the air, something in the very bones of the farm. She had noticed in the last few days that the animals had been acting a bit differently. The pigs, usually lively and inquisitive, had been quieter than usual. The cows, too, seemed restless, their low moans carrying an unusual tension. Even the rabbits, typically skittish and quick, seemed more subdued. Emma shook her head. She didn't want to believe it. Could it be that the strange birth of the two-headed duckling was connected to something larger? Something wrong with the land itself? She tried to push the thought aside, but it clung to her, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. "John," she began, turning back to her husband, "I think we need to check on the cows today, too, just to be sure everything's all right. And maybe we should call Dr. Foster." John looked up at her, a frown tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Dr. Foster? You really think we need to call him already?" "I don't know," Emma replied, her voice edged with concern. but it can't hurt to ask. We need to know what we're dealing with, and I don't want to wait too long if something's going wrong. John sighed, running a hand through his hair. All right, I'll go out to the barn with you. Let's make sure the cows are all right. But you're right. We don't know what's going on, and we can't take any chances. Together, they walked out of the house, the cool morning air greeting them as they stepped onto the porch. The farm stretched out before them, fields and pastures interspersed with barns and pens, all bathed in the soft light of dawn. The animals were beginning to stir, the familiar sounds of morning life filling the air. But the unease was still there, lingering in the background, like an unanswered question. The barn was quiet as they approached. The cows were inside, chewing cud in the dim light. Emma's heart gave a small flutter of worry as she glanced at the animals. The cows, Jasmine and Daisy, their two prized milking cows, stood apart from one another, not moving as they usually did. Jasmine, in particular, seemed sluggish. Her ears drooped, and her usually bright eyes looked dull. Emma stepped closer, rubbing Jasmine's side gently, trying to gauge her condition. The cow shifted uncomfortably but didn't respond as warmly as usual. Emma frowned, her fingers brushing over the animal's swollen belly. John, something's not right, she said, her voice tightening with concern. Jasmine's milk. It's gone. Look at her. She's acting off. John stepped closer, inspecting Jasmine's condition with a practiced eye. He gently lifted the cow's tail, inspecting her hindquarters, but found nothing immediately out of place. Jasmine wasn't sick. There were no signs of infection or injury, but still, she didn't seem herself. There was no sign of her usual milk production, and her stomach, once round and firm with milk, was flat. Even her movements lacked the usual energy. I've never seen her like this, John muttered, his brows furrowed in confusion. It's as if she's not even lactating. Emma's heart skipped a beat. If Jasmine wasn't producing milk, then that was a serious problem for the farm. The cows were a crucial part of their livelihood. Without their milk, they wouldn't have enough to sell or even enough for their own needs. She glanced at John, the weight of the situation settling like a stone in her chest. I'll go get Dr. Foster, she said, turning toward the door. We need to know what's going on, and we need to know now. John watched her go, his worry deepening. He didn't like the idea of calling in help so soon. It felt like an admission of failure, a sign that something was beyond their control. But as he looked at Jasmine again, he knew she wasn't the only one acting strangely. The animals, the land, it all seemed out of balance. And he had a growing fear that this wasn't just a coincidence. As Emma made her way to the phone inside the house, John remained in the barn, his eyes scanning the animals. The two-headed duckling had to be linked to this somehow. There was no way it was just a freak occurrence. And as much as he didn't want to admit it, he was beginning to feel that something was wrong with the farm in ways they couldn't yet understand. Chapter 4. A visit from Dr. Foster. The phone call to Dr. Foster wasn't something Emma had wanted to make, but as she dialed the number, she knew it was necessary. The unease she had been feeling all day hadn't gone away. Something was amiss, and they needed answers. The two-headed duckling, Jasmine's sudden loss of milk, and the strange behavior of the animals. It all pointed to something bigger than they could handle on their own. Dr. Foster, the local veterinarian, had been the family's trusted doctor for years. His visits were often routine, but today, Emma had the sinking feeling that this wouldn't be a simple checkup. When the phone finally rang and the familiar voice of Dr. Foster answered, Emma's heart skipped a beat. Dr. Foster, this is Emma Mitchell. I'm afraid we need your help. It's urgent, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. We've got a situation with our animals. Emma, what's going on? Dr. Foster's voice was warm, but there was a sense of concern in it too, picking up on the tension in her words. It's the cows mostly. Jasmine, she's not producing milk anymore. We're worried. She's acting off, sluggish, like she's sick, but we can't figure out why. Emma explained quickly, her mind racing. And we've got another problem. One of our ducks, well, a duckling. It was born with two heads. I know that sounds strange, but we need to know what we're dealing with, There was a long pause on the other end, and Emma could almost hear Dr. Foster's mind working, trying to process the information. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I'll be over as soon as I can, Emma. It sounds like you've got quite a few issues on your hands. I'll bring my equipment and take a look at Jasmine first, and then we'll see about the duckling. I don't want to speculate too much, but I think we'll need to examine everything thoroughly. I'll leave right away." "Thank you, Dr. Foster," Emma replied, relief flooding through her. "We'll be waiting." After hanging up, she turned to John, who had been standing by the door, his brow furrowed with worry. His shoulders slumped as he met her gaze. "Dr. Foster's on his way. He's bringing his equipment to check on Jasmine and the duckling. He said he'd take a good look at everything, try to figure out what's going on." John sighed deeply. "Good. We need answers. I don't like not knowing, Emma." "I know," she replied quietly, glancing out the window. "We'll know soon enough." They spent the next few hours waiting, trying to keep busy with the normal chores while the anxiety grew heavier in the air. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows over the barnyard as they continued to care for the animals. But every movement felt slower, more deliberate, as if the whole world was holding its breath in anticipation of something. Around mid-afternoon, Dr. Foster finally arrived, his truck pulling up the long driveway with a crunch of gravel. The tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting his glasses as he waved to John and Emma. He was a man of few words, always focused and steady, but there was an air of respect and kindness about him that Emma always appreciated. "Afternoon, Emma." "John," Dr. Foster greeted them, his eyes scanning the farmyard with an experienced gaze. "I hear we've got quite a mess to sort through today." Emma met him at the barn door. "We do. Come in, I'll show you to Jasmine first. She's been acting off for the past couple of days." Dr. Foster nodded, his expression serious. "Let's start there." The three of them made their way to the barn, where Jasmine and Daisy stood quietly in their stalls. Jasmine looked up as they entered, but her usual bright eyes were dull and tired. She shifted restlessly, her large body swaying slightly as if trying to find comfort. "Poor thing," Emma murmured, her hand gently stroking the cow's side. Dr. Foster stepped closer, his hand steady as he began to examine the cow. He placed his fingers on Jasmine's neck, checking her pulse, and gently pressed against her abdomen. After a few moments of quiet probing, he looked up at Emma and John. "I'm afraid this is more than just a minor illness," Dr. Foster said. "Jasmine's not sick per se, but she's not in good condition. Her milk production has stopped, which can happen for several reasons: stress, diet changes, or sometimes a hormonal imbalance. Could it be something we've done wrong?" John asked, his voice tinged with guilt. "We've been feeding her the same, haven't we? Her diet is fine." "It's not that," Dr. Foster reassured him. "There may be something going on deeper, something related to her reproductive system. Could be an infection, or it could just be that her body is reacting to stress. But I won't know for sure without further tests. I'll need to take a blood sample and run some diagnostics." Emma nodded, her face creased with concern. "I understand. Do what you need to." Dr. Foster went to work, drawing the blood sample from Jasmine and preparing the necessary tests. As he worked, Emma kept a watchful eye on Jasmine, stroking her side gently, trying to comfort the animal. John was pacing around the barn, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Once Dr. Foster finished with Jasmine, he stood up, wiping his hands with a cloth. "Now, let's take a look at that duckling of yours," he said, his tone much softer than it had been with the cow. "I've heard of strange occurrences like this, but I've never had the chance to examine a two-headed animal. Let's see what we're dealing with." The three of them made their way to the pen where the duckling had been resting. It was still with its mother, though she seemed to be keeping her distance. The tiny creature was resting in the straw, its two heads nestled close to each other. Dr. Foster crouched down beside the pen, his eyes examining the duckling carefully. He reached out and gently picked it up, holding it with great care. Emma watched as Dr. Foster studied the little creature, his brow furrowed in thought. "This is unusual, to say the least," Dr. Foster murmured, his voice filled with curiosity. But I've read about cases like this before. It's called polycephaly, when an animal is born with two heads. It's extremely rare, and usually these animals don't survive long. Emma's heart sank at the words. Does that mean it won't make it? I can't say for sure just yet, Dr. Foster replied. Sometimes, animals with this condition can live long, healthy lives. It depends on how the two heads share control of the body. If they can work together, the duckling might have a chance. But it's going to need extra care, and we'll need to monitor it closely. We'll keep it comfortable, feed it properly, and see if it thrives. Dr. Foster gently set the duckling back in its straw bed and stood up. He turned to Emma and John. The situation with Jasmine is a bit more complicated. I'll need to run some more tests to be sure. But for now, keep an eye on both of them. If Jasmine continues to refuse to eat or doesn't show any improvement after a few days, we may need to take more drastic steps. Emma nodded, her thoughts racing. Thank you, Dr. Foster. We'll do everything we can. Dr. Foster gave them both a reassuring smile, though his eyes were filled with the gravity of the situation. I'll check back in a few days, but for now, let's focus on keeping the animals calm. That's the best we can do. As he left the barn, John and Emma exchanged a long look. The day had brought more questions than answers, and while Dr. Foster's visit had been reassuring, it hadn't quelled the unease that lingered in the air. There was more to this than they could understand, and they couldn't shake the feeling that the farm's troubles were only just beginning. Chapter 5. Unseen Forces. The next few days passed in a blur of uncertainty and exhaustion. Despite Dr. Foster's reassurances, the unease that hung over the farm like a heavy fog only seemed to grow thicker with each passing hour. Jasmine's condition had not improved. She was still sluggish, her milk production still absent, and there was a noticeable lack of energy in her steps. Every time Emma checked on her, it felt like the situation was slipping further from their control. Meanwhile, the two-headed duckling, though still alive, seemed to be struggling more and more. It was feeding as Dr. Foster had suggested, but one of its heads often seemed disoriented, as though it wasn't quite in sync with the other. It would dart around suddenly, as though startled by something invisible, then settle back down, only for the process to repeat itself moments later. Its mother, usually attentive and protective, had begun to pull away more and more, as if sensing that something was wrong with her offspring in ways beyond what Emma could understand. John, too, was struggling with the weight of it all. Though he tried to keep a brave face for Emma, she could see how the strain of the past few days was wearing on him. He spent long hours in the barn with the animals, but he couldn't shake the feeling that things were slipping through their fingers. There was an unnatural stillness in the barnyard. No chatter from the geese or excited quacking from the ducks. Even the pigs, usually so full of life, seemed unnaturally quiet. It was as if everything on the farm was waiting for something just beyond the horizon. One morning, after a particularly restless night, Emma stood by the kitchen window, staring out over the farm. The early light was dim, tinged with a strange orange hue. She squinted, wondering if it was just her tired eyes or something more. The land itself seemed to shimmer faintly, as though there was an invisible ripple spreading out over the fields. She shook her head, trying to push the thought away. It was absurd, she told herself. There was no such thing as land turning strange, as if it had a life of its own. Still, it nagged at her. Emma? John's voice pulled her from her thoughts, his voice softer than usual. She turned to face him. He stood in the doorway, his hands resting on the frame. He looked older, somehow like the weight of something heavy had settled on him. Something's not right, John, she said quietly, not even realizing she was speaking aloud. The land, it's different. Don't you feel it? John's face tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line. He nodded, slowly. I've been thinking the same thing. The animals, the way they're acting, this isn't just sickness. There's something else going on. Emma took a deep breath and looked back out at the farm. The cows, though still unwell, had begun to wander more restlessly in their pasture. Even the rabbits, which had been calm before, were now darting about their hutch in erratic patterns. The farm felt unsettled, as if it was on the verge of something, but no one could say what. She couldn't shake the feeling that the events surrounding the two-headed duckling and Jasmine's condition weren't just isolated incidents. Something larger was happening, something that was affecting everything and everyone on the farm. Later that day, after Emma and John had spent hours cleaning the barn and tending to the animals, Dr. Foster returned for another visit. His presence, though reassuring in many ways, also brought a sense of foreboding. Emma greeted him at the door, her expression tight with worry. "How is Jasmine?" he asked, his eyes scanning the farmyard for any signs of change. "No better," Emma replied, swallowing her frustration. "She's still not producing milk. Her behavior is the same, slow, distant. It's as though she's fading. It's just so strange." Dr. Foster didn't immediately respond. Instead, he glanced around the barnyard, his brow furrowing. "I can't say I like the look of this place today," he said after a long pause. "It's as if there's a heaviness in the air. I've seen farms go through hard times, but it feels different." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. She wasn't the only one who had noticed. "What do you mean, different?" John asked, stepping closer. His voice was a bit sharper than usual, his nerves stretched thin by days of uncertainty. "I don't know yet," Dr. Foster replied, his tone grave. "But there's something going on here that I can't put my finger on. Something in the soil, perhaps. Or maybe something deeper, something that's affecting the entire ecosystem of the farm. I'll need to take more samples of the soil, the water, and anything else that could be causing this. There's no simple answer here." Emma nodded, but she could tell Dr. Foster was just as baffled as they were. There was no clear diagnosis, no clear solution. Only more questions. It was unsettling, to say the least. After a tense few moments, Dr. Foster moved toward the barn, ready to check on the animals again. Emma, lost in her thoughts, followed him. She had always trusted the soil, the land that had fed them for decades. It had always provided, through seasons of plenty and drought, through hard winters and long summers. But now, she couldn't shake the feeling that the land had turned against them, as if it had been holding its breath and was about to let out some terrible secret. "Emma," Dr. Foster said quietly, pulling her from her thoughts. She turned to him, her eyes searching his face for answers. "I'm not sure what's going on with Jasmine yet, but there's something else you should know. The soil tests I took last week, they were strange. There's a chemical imbalance in the earth, something unnatural." Emma's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, unnatural?" "I don't know," he said, his eyes clouded with uncertainty. "But it's as though the ground itself is changing. It's something in the minerals, or perhaps something that has been introduced to the environment. It's hard to say, but I've never seen anything like it." John's face went pale, and Emma's throat tightened with fear. Could that be what's affecting Jasmine? And the other animals? Dr. Foster looked troubled. Possibly. If the soil is tainted in some way, it could be affecting their health. Animals can ingest toxins from the soil, from the plants they graze on. It would explain their strange behavior, and it might explain why Jasmine has stopped producing milk. Emma felt a wave of dread wash over her. The farm had been her home, her life, her everything. And now it felt like that very foundation was crumbling beneath her. She gripped the railing of the barn door, the wood rough under her hands. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Foster sighed deeply, his face filled with concern. "Right now, there's not much to do but wait for the results of the further tests. I've sent some of the soil and water samples off to the lab, and I'll have more answers soon. In the meantime, try to keep the animals calm and be extra cautious about what they're eating. If there's a contamination, the last thing you want is to exacerbate it." John clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. "This is madness. What's causing this? Why now? This is our livelihood, our life. Everything we've worked for." Dr. Foster's face softened, and he placed a hand on John's shoulder. I know, but we need to stay level-headed. If this is something from the earth itself, we'll figure it out. We've dealt with tough situations before. We'll get through this." Emma forced a tight smile, though her insides felt hollow. She wasn't sure how much more they could take. But Dr. Foster was right. They had always managed to overcome hardship before. Somehow, they had to trust that they could do it again. As Dr. Foster left to continue his testing, Emma and John stood in the barn, looking out at the quiet fields. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the land, and the unsettling silence seemed to deepen with each passing minute. There was no turning back now. They would have to wait to see what the tests would reveal. But Emma had a growing sense that whatever was happening on the farm, it wasn't going to be easy to fix. Chapter 6. Whispers of the Past. The days that followed felt like a slow and painful drag. Emma and John went through the motions, feeding the animals, cleaning the barn, and trying their best to stay hopeful. But no matter how much they worked, the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong wouldn't leave them. Dr. Foster's visit had been unsettling, and though the lab tests were supposed to bring clarity, they only deepened the mystery. Every morning, Emma would rise early to check on Jasmine, but the cow's condition remained the same. She wasn't getting worse, but she wasn't improving either. Her once vibrant coat had dulled, her steps heavy and slow. The two-headed duckling, still living against all odds, seemed to be getting weaker. Emma had been watching it closely, and she could see that one of its heads seemed to be losing strength, its movements sluggish and erratic. Despite Dr. Foster's efforts, neither animal seemed to be responding to any of the treatments, and the strange behavior of the other animals continued. The geese had become even more erratic, honking and flapping their wings, as though they were startled by some invisible presence. The pigs, once playful and curious, now huddled together, silent and still. The farm, once so full of life and comfort, had become a place of confusion, fear, and anxiety. One evening, after another long day of trying to manage the animals, Emma and John sat together in their kitchen. The light from the oil lamp flickered gently, casting long shadows on the walls. They hadn't said much to each other all day, too tired, too overwhelmed by everything that was happening. But now, as they sat together in the quiet of the house, the weight of their unspoken fears felt heavier than ever. "We need to talk, Emma," John said, his voice quiet, but with a firm resolve. Emma turned to him, her heart sinking. She knew where this conversation was headed. The exhaustion, the worry, it had been creeping up on them both for days. She had seen it in his eyes, the way he stared at the empty fields or lingered by the barn longer than usual, as though waiting for something to change. "I know," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She had been thinking the same thing. The farm wasn't just unwell, the land itself felt different. But there was something deeper here, something they weren't seeing, something that felt tied to the very roots of the earth itself. "We've been dealing with this for days now, and I don't know what to think anymore, Emma," John continued. He rubbed his hand over his face, his old eyes filled with worry. "The animals, they're not acting right, and neither are we. It's as though something's changed. Not just with Jasmine or the duckling, but with everything." Emma reached across the table and placed her hand over his. She knew what he meant. It wasn't just the sickness of their animals. It was the very energy of the land that had shifted. The weather had turned unseasonably cold, and there was a dampness in the air that hadn't been there before. Even the wind had changed. It no longer felt like the warm, comforting breeze that used to rustle through the trees in the late afternoons. Now it felt like a constant whisper, like the land itself was speaking, whispering something that Emma couldn't quite understand. "There's something happening on this land, John," Emma said softly. "Something we can't explain. It's like the earth itself is sick. And if the land is sick, everything else will be too." John nodded slowly, his face creased with thought. He stood up from the table, pacing around the room. "I've been thinking about that too. I've heard stories, old stories, things that people don't talk about much anymore. But when I was a boy, my father would tell me about things happening on the farm. Strange things, things that didn't make sense. He always brushed it off, told me not to worry, that it was just the way things go sometimes." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She had heard those stories too, but she had never really believed them. They were old tales, stories that had been passed down through generations. Stories about the land, about curses, about things that could happen when the balance of nature was disturbed. What kind of things? Emma asked, her voice barely audible. John stopped pacing and turned to face her. He used to talk about how sometimes the land could get upset. How when certain things happened, like a shift in the weather or a disturbance in the soil, it could affect everything around it. The animals, the crops, the whole farm. He said that if the balance of nature was disturbed, the land would turn on you, and nothing would ever be the same again. It was like the earth would fight back. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. Her mind raced, her thoughts spinning. The more John spoke, the more it all began to make sense. The strange behavior of the animals, the sickness that had fallen over Jasmine, the two-headed duckling, the eerie stillness that had settled over the farm. All of it seemed to fit together, like pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting to be uncovered. Do you think that could be what's happening here? Emma asked, her voice trembling with fear. I don't know, John said, his face pale. But I've been thinking about it, Emma, and I think it's time we start listening to those old stories. It may be the only way to save this place. And if there's one thing I know for sure, it's that we can't do this alone. Emma's heart sank. The thought of facing whatever it was that had taken root in the soil of their farm was terrifying. But she knew John was right. There was no more time to waste. If something was happening to the land, to the very earth beneath their feet, they needed to understand it, and fast. I'll go to the old farm, Emma said. Her voice steady despite the unease that knotted in her stomach. I'll talk to the people who remember the old ways. Maybe they can tell us something we don't know. John nodded, his face softening. We'll need help. This isn't something we can fix on our own. The old farm. Emma hadn't thought about it in years. But now, as she stared at John's weary face, she knew it was the only place left to turn. It was a small, forgotten plot of land just on the outskirts of town, once owned by a distant relative of John's. It had been abandoned for years, but the stories that surrounded it were anything but forgotten. That was where the old people, the ones who had lived on the land before them, had passed down their knowledge. And if there was any truth to John's father's stories, it was there that Emma might find the answers they so desperately needed. The next morning, Emma set out early, her heart heavy with anticipation. She could already feel the shift in the air as she walked down the familiar dirt path toward the old farm. It was only a few miles away, but the journey felt like it would take forever. The wind had picked up again, but this time it was colder, sharper. It tugged at her coat, making her pull it tighter around herself. As she walked, the thought of what she might find or what she might not kept her mind occupied. She had always thought those old stories were just that, stories. But now, as she approached the overgrown field that led to the abandoned house, she wasn't so sure anymore. Something had changed on the farm, something that neither she nor John could explain, and it seemed that the answers she was searching for were buried in the past. When she reached the old farmhouse, she was surprised to find it wasn't as abandoned as she had remembered. The door creaked slightly, and as she stepped inside, the faint scent of dust and old wood filled her nostrils. There were no signs of life, but something about the house felt different. It was as though the house itself was waiting for her to discover its secrets. Emma took a deep breath and stepped farther into the house, determined to find what she had come for. But little did she know, the answers she sought would come from a place far darker than she could have ever imagined. Chapter 7. Echoes from the Shadow. The moment Emma stepped through the door of the old farmhouse, a strange sense of familiarity washed over her, though she couldn't place why. It had been years since she had been here, decades, in fact. The house was much like it had always been, dusty, worn, and shrouded in memories. But now, in the half-light, it felt as though the walls themselves were holding secrets. There was a stillness, an almost oppressive quiet that weighed heavily on her shoulders. She paused for a moment, feeling the air thick with years of forgotten history. The floorboards creaked beneath her boots as she made her way further inside, careful not to disturb too much. She had heard stories from John's father about this place, stories that sent chills down her spine even now. It was said to be a house full of old things, things that didn't belong, things from another time. Emma had never paid much attention to these tales, chalking them up to the kind of talk old people indulged in. But today, as she stood in this forgotten corner of the world, she couldn't help but feel the weight of their truth. She crossed the main hall and entered the living room, where an old rocking chair sat near the hearth, the wood darkened with age. The chair rocked slightly, as if someone had just been there. A cold shiver ran through her, and she quickly averted her gaze to the shelves along the wall. The dust that settled on the furniture here had a peculiar sheen, as though it had been disturbed recently. Emma felt a wave of unease creep over her, but she pushed it down. The farmhouse had once been part of the land that now belonged to the larger estate where Emma and John lived. Emma's father-in-law had spent his youth here, running the farm with his own father before passing it on to John. But after the old man had passed away, and with no children left to care for the place, the house had been abandoned, left to rot slowly beneath the weight of time. Emma walked over to the dusty shelves, her fingers brushing the edge of a worn, leather-bound book that seemed out of place. It wasn't the usual collection of old novels or farming journals one might expect to find in such a house. No, this book was different. It felt heavy in her hands, almost as though it was alive, carrying some sort of forgotten knowledge. She opened the book, its pages brittle from years of neglect. The writing inside was faint but legible, a mix of old script and hand-drawn diagrams. Her eyes scanned the pages quickly, picking out words here and there that made her stomach churn. The book was about the land, the soil, the plants, and the mysterious energies that could inhabit the earth. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she turned the pages faster, the unease growing deeper within her. She began to see words she recognized: balance, ritual, curse. And then there it was, a passage that sent a chill through her entire body. When the land grows bitter, when the balance is disturbed, the earth will fight back. It will take from you what it has given, and no prayer, no plea will stop it. The land will ask for a payment, and it will not rest until it is repaid. Her hands shook as she continued reading, her mind racing. The passage went on to describe ways to appease the land, methods passed down through generations. Rituals, offerings, and ceremonies meant to restore balance when the earth became ill. The final words of the passage echoed in her mind. The earth will heal, but it demands its due. Emma closed the book with a snap, the weight of its contents crashing down on her like a heavy fog. She had heard stories like the one John had shared with her, but this felt different. It wasn't just a story. It wasn't just folklore. There was truth here, dark and undeniable. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The old farmhouse seemed to pulse with an energy she couldn't quite explain. She glanced around the room, her eyes falling on a small door at the back, almost hidden behind a thick veil of cobwebs. It was a cellar door, the kind she had never noticed before. Without thinking, she moved toward it, drawn by an unseen force, as if the house itself was guiding her. The door creaked open with a sound that seemed too loud in the silence of the house. The air below was musty, thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Emma hesitated for only a moment before stepping down into the dark, her boots landing softly on the cold, stone floor. The cellar was damp and narrow, the walls lined with shelves full of jars, old preserves, dried herbs, and odd-looking bottles filled with liquids of various colors. But it was the far corner of the room that caught her eye. There, resting on a dusty table, was an old iron box. The box was intricately carved with symbols she didn't recognize, symbols that looked strangely familiar, as though she had seen them before in the old book. Her pulse quickened as she approached the table. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she lifted the lid of the box. Inside, resting on a bed of straw, was a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. Emma's hands shook as she unwrapped the bundle, revealing a stone, smooth, dark, and heavy, with strange markings etched into its surface. It felt ancient, alive in her hands, as though it had been waiting for her touch. The moment she held it, the air in the cellar seemed to shift. A low hum began to fill the space, vibrating against her chest, and the temperature dropped. The shadows around her deepened, and for a fleeting moment, Emma swore she saw something moving in the corner of her eye. But when she turned, there was nothing there. The stone pulsed in her hands, a faint glow emanating from its surface. Emma felt a strange pull, an urge to place it back in the box, to hide it away as it had been for so long. But something told her that this stone, this object, was the key to everything. The strange happenings on the farm, the illnesses of the animals, the unnatural quiet that had settled over the land. She closed the box, cradling the stone in her hands. Her heart pounded as she climbed back up the stairs, the box securely tucked under her arm. She didn't know what to make of it yet, but she knew she had to take it back to John. They had to figure out what it all meant together. Whatever this was, it was far bigger than just sick animals and bad soil. This was something ancient, something that had been buried beneath the farm for generations. When she returned to the farmhouse, John was waiting for her in the kitchen. His eyes locked onto the box immediately, and he rose slowly from his seat, his face pale. "Emma, what did you find?" he asked, his voice thick with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Emma set the box down on the table, her hands still shaking. "I think I found the answer, but it's not what I expected." As she explained what she had discovered in the cellar, John listened quietly, his face unreadable. The weight of her words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Whatever was happening to their farm, whatever was sickening their animals, it was far beyond their control. It was as though the earth itself was demanding something from them, something that only those who had walked the land before them understood. "I don't know what to do, John," Emma said quietly, her voice trembling, "but I think the land wants something from us. Something we've overlooked." John stared at the stone, his expression conflicted. "And what if the stories are true? What if the land does want something from us? What if we've already ignored it for too long?" Emma didn't have an answer, and in the silence of the room, she realized that they were standing on the edge of something they couldn't fully understand. The land had been silent for years, but now it was speaking to them, and whether they were ready or not, they would have to listen. Chapter 8. The Land's Reckoning. The morning after Emma returned from the old farmhouse was thick with fog, the kind that clung to everything and blurred the edges of the world. The sun struggled to break through the heavy mist, casting a pale, sickly light over the land. Felt wrong, unnatural. The farm, once filled with the sounds of clucking, snorting, and mooing, was unnervingly quiet. Even the birds seemed to have abandoned their songs. John and Emma stood on the porch, their faces pale and drawn. Emma's hands gripped the box, the stone resting heavily inside, its strange energy pulsing through the wood. She hadn't told John everything she had seen in the cellar. She hadn't told him about the whispers, the flicker of shadows that had seemed to surround her, or the pull of the stone itself. But now, as they looked out over the fields, the weight of it all seemed to hang between them. There was no avoiding it any longer. Something had to be done. "We can't keep ignoring this," John said quietly, his voice carrying a note of resolve that Emma hadn't heard in weeks. His eyes were fixed on the barn, where the animals stood motionless, as though they too were waiting for something. Emma nodded slowly. "The animals are suffering, John. And it's not just them. The land is dying. It feels like the earth itself is holding its breath." John's gaze hardened. "And I don't know if we can bring it back, Emma. I've never believed in any of the old superstitions. But what if it's true? What if we've been too busy with our lives to notice the signs?" Emma glanced down at the box in her hands, then back at the barn. "Maybe it's time we listen to those who came before us. Maybe this land does have a price." The two of them stood in silence, the cold mist curling around them, the barn and fields eerily quiet. Emma could feel the weight of the stone in her hands, the pulse of something ancient that tugged at her with every beat of her heart. She didn't know what the land wanted from them, if anything, but she knew one thing for certain. They had to act quickly before the sickness spread any further. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady now. "We need to see Jasmine. We need to figure out what's happening before it's too late." John nodded, his face grim. He followed Emma as they made their way down the porch steps and across the yard toward the barn. The ground felt different beneath their feet, softer, almost as though it were giving way beneath them. Emma's boots sank deeper into the earth with every step, the soil heavier, as though it were pulling her down. She didn't dare look back at the farmhouse, where the stone still rested inside its box. She had no idea what it would take to fix what was broken, but she had to try. Inside the barn, the animals were quiet, too quiet. The cows stood motionless in their stalls, their eyes dull and unblinking. The pigs, once playful and curious, had retreated to the farthest corner of the pen. Even the ducks and geese were still, their usual honks and quacking absent, replaced by a silence that weighed on Emma's chest. Jasmine's in the back, John muttered, as they made their way deeper into the barn. He seemed just as uneasy as Emma felt. His hand hovered near the wall, but it didn't touch anything. It was as though he didn't want to disturb the strange atmosphere that filled the air. They found Jasmine in the last stall, standing with her head lowered. Her coat was matted and dull, her ribs visible under the thick fur. The heavy scent of sickness hung in the air around her. Emma knelt beside the cow, her heart aching at the sight. Jasmine's breathing was shallow, her body trembling slightly, as though even the simple act of standing was too much for her. Emma reached out, running her fingers through Jasmine's matted fur. She could feel the warmth of the cow's body, but it was faint, as though her life force was slowly ebbing away. There was no sign of milk, no glistening drops on the udder, no warmth of the cow's usual tenderness. Jasmine had been their prize cow, the one that had always given them the most milk, the one who had been healthy and strong. Now she seemed like a shadow of her former self. "We need to do something," Emma whispered, her voice tight with fear. "We can't just watch her suffer like this." John stepped forward, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I'll fetch the salves and herbs we've been using. There's no harm in trying, at least." But as he turned to leave, Emma's gaze shifted to the far corner of the barn. The two-headed duckling was standing there, looking up at her with wide, unblinking eyes. Its two heads swayed slightly, one of them twitching in a way that made Emma's heart skip a beat. Something was wrong, something more than just the illness that had fallen over their animals. This duckling, this strange creature, was somehow connected to all of it. Emma could feel the pull of its existence, like a thread running through the heart of the farm, tying everything together. "John," Emma called softly, her voice trembling. "Come look at this." John turned, his eyes falling on the duckling. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The two-headed creature seemed to watch them with a strange intensity, one head cocked to the side, as if it were waiting for something. "It's the duckling," Emma said slowly, her mind racing. "I think it's connected to all of this. The way it was born, so strange, so unnatural. It's as if it's the sign of something bigger, something that's not right with the land." John's face hardened, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "The stories, they say that when something unnatural is born, it's a sign that something has disturbed the balance. Maybe the land's trying to warn us." Emma's heart beat faster. But what if it's not just a warning? What if it's the beginning of something more? What if the land is trying to tell us something we don't understand? John took a deep breath, and his eyes moved to the stone in Emma's hands, still resting in its box. "We don't have much time, Emma. If we're going to fix this, we need to understand what's happening. We need to figure out what the land wants from us." Just then, a loud noise echoed through the barn. A sudden, sharp cry from Jasmine. Emma and John rushed to her side, but it was too late. Jasmine's body shuddered violently, and with one final breath, she collapsed onto the ground, her eyes wide and vacant. The sound of her fall reverberated through the barn like a thunderclap, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma knelt beside Jasmine's still body, her heart breaking. This was it. The sickness had claimed her. But why? What had they done to deserve this? As Emma sat there, her hands pressed against Jasmine's cooling skin, she felt something stir beneath the earth. It was faint, but it was there. A pulse, deep and low, as though the earth itself was breathing, as though the land had just exhaled in relief. But at what cost? And what was to come next? Chapter 9. The Price of Silence. The wind had picked up by the time they buried Jasmine. The air, once heavy and still, now carried with it a sharp, biting cold that seemed to slice through the skin. Emma stood over the fresh mound of earth, her hands trembling as she placed a bundle of lavender and wildflowers atop the grave. Her heart felt as though it had been carved open, the grief so deep and raw she could hardly breathe. Jasmine had been more than just a cow. She had been part of their family, a constant presence through the years. The loss cut deeper than Emma had anticipated. John stood beside her, his face unreadable as he watched the earth swallow the last traces of the animal that had been so full of life. But Emma could see the storm brewing within him. His fists were clenched, and his jaw was set tight, the same way it had been when he first noticed the sickness spreading across the farm. "Something's wrong, Emma," he said quietly, his voice thick with frustration. "The land doesn't act like this unless something is forcing it. It's like it's angry with us." Emma didn't reply at first, her eyes fixed on the grave. The words she had read in that old book echoed in her mind. The land will demand its due. Was this the price? Had they ignored the signs for too long? Was the sickness, the strange birth of the two-headed duckling, Jasmine's death, was it all a warning? Or was there something more sinister at work? "We can't just stand here, John," Emma said softly, turning to face him. "We need to do something. We need to fix this." John's gaze hardened, but he nodded. "I know, but where do we start?" Emma bit her lip, feeling the weight of the box with the stone still resting in her hands. The stone seemed to hum faintly, almost as if it were calling to her, urging her to act. The longer she held it, the more it seemed to stir something deep within her. A sense of urgency, a feeling that they were running out of time. The two-headed duckling had not moved from the barn since Jasmine's death. Emma had gone back to check on it, but it hadn't eaten. It hadn't even made a sound. It simply stood there, its two heads swaying ever so slightly, its eyes wide and unblinking. Emma felt an odd connection to it now, as if its existence was somehow tied to their fate. "We need to go back to the farm," Emma said suddenly. "The stone. It's part of this, I can feel it." John looked at her, his expression filled with uncertainty, but he didn't argue. They made their way back to the farmhouse in silence, the weight of their loss hanging heavily between them. The farm had always been a place of peace for them, a sanctuary of simple pleasures, the rhythms of daily life grounding them. But now it felt like a place under siege, a place on the edge of something far darker than they had ever imagined. As they entered the house, Emma placed the box down on the table with care, the stone inside still glowing faintly. She glanced at John, who had already gone to the fireplace, lighting a small fire to ward off the growing chill. The house, like the land, felt colder than it had before. "I can't shake the feeling that we're running out of time," Emma said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything's changing so fast, John. I don't know what to do, but I think the land is calling us. It wants something." John came over, his face serious. "You've been holding onto that stone all day, Emma. What do you think it means? Why now?" Emma's heart raced. She didn't have an answer, but the pull of the stone was undeniable. The closer she came to it, the stronger the sensation became. It was as if the land itself was speaking to her through the stone, whispering its demands, urging her to listen. She wasn't sure if it was her mind playing tricks on her, but the stone seemed to resonate with the rhythms of the earth, with the pulse of the land beneath their feet. "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling, "but I think it's telling us to restore something, to balance what's been broken." John looked at the stone thoughtfully. "But how? How do we fix something we don't even understand?" Before Emma could answer, there was a loud, frantic knock on the door. Both of them froze. It was a strange hour, and the sudden intrusion sent a jolt of unease through Emma. John stood, his expression one of confusion, and moved cautiously toward the door. When he opened it, there was no one standing on the other side. Instead, a small figure, no taller than a child, was crouched on the ground just outside the threshold. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she saw the familiar silhouette. It was the old woman, the one who had lived in the outskirts of the village, the one who no one spoke of anymore. She had long, gnarled hands, her skin the color of weathered leather, and her eyes, Emma had always thought they were unsettling, as if they could see too much. She had always been a figure of folklore, someone who had lived alone in the woods, known for her strange remedies and whispered secrets. But now, as she rose slowly to her feet and made her way inside without a word, Emma couldn't help but feel that the woman's presence here wasn't just coincidence. The woman didn't speak at first, but her gaze fell immediately on the stone. Her eyes widened slightly, and she took a deep, rattling breath. "You found it," she murmured, her voice like the crackling of dry leaves. "The stone of the earth's heart. The land's answer. It's been waiting for you." Emma felt a chill ripple down her spine. "Who are you?" she demanded, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. "What do you know about this?" The woman's eyes softened with a hint of sadness, but she didn't answer the question directly. Instead, she looked toward the barn, her gaze distant. "The land does not forget," she said, her voice low and knowing. "When you take from it, you must give back. When you sow, you must tend. When you allow it to wither, it will take its toll." John stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean? What's happening to our farm? Our animals?" The old woman turned to him, her face etched with years of hardship. "You've angered it whether you meant to or not. The balance has been disturbed. It was never meant for you to claim all of this land without giving something in return." Her words hung heavy in the air, and Emma's chest tightened. The earth, the stone, it was all connected somehow. They had been so focused on their own survival, on keeping their farm running smoothly, that they hadn't stopped to consider what they owed the land. "But how do we fix it?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What do we have to give?" The old woman looked at her with a mix of pity and understanding. "You will know when the time comes," she said cryptically. "But first you must make peace with the land. Only then will it release its grip on you." With that, she turned and walked out the door without another word, leaving Emma and John standing in the doorway, the weight of her cryptic words hanging between them like a storm cloud. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Emma and John exchanged a look, both of them feeling the weight of what was coming. The land was asking for something, and they had no idea if they could give it in time. Chapter 10. Restoration. The days that followed the old woman's visit felt like a blur, an endless series of restless nights and long, silent mornings. The house was quieter than it had ever been, the weight of their grief hanging heavily in the air, only broken by the occasional sound of hooves or the rustling of animals in their pens. But there was an unease that lingered in every corner of the farm, a deep, unsettling feeling that the balance was still out of reach. Emma could feel it with every step she took on the land. The earth seemed to resist her, the soil colder, harder than it had ever been. Even the trees at the edge of the property stood as though in mourning, their leaves curling and wilting despite the early signs of spring. The two-headed duckling remained in the barn, its strange, unsettling presence never far from Emma's mind. It was as though it was waiting for something, waiting for the moment when everything would come to a head. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the answers lay buried in the earth, somewhere deep beneath the surface, waiting for her to uncover them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a red glow over the farm, Emma and John stood on the porch, both of them weary from the day's work. They hadn't spoken much since the old woman's visit, both lost in their thoughts, unsure of how to move forward. But something had changed in John. There was a new fire in his eyes, a quiet determination that Emma hadn't seen in him for a long time. "We need to make it right," John said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "We've been given a second chance, but we can't keep pretending nothing's wrong. We need to do what she said. Make peace with the land." Emma turned to him, her heart heavy with uncertainty. "But how, John? What if we can't? What if it's too late?" John's face softened. He reached out and took her hand in his grip strong and reassuring. "I don't know how, but I know we have to try. We can't keep living like this with the land angry at us. If we don't do something, we'll lose everything. The animals, the farm, us." She nodded slowly, her chest tightening. Deep down, she knew he was right. The The land was sick, and they were the cause of it. They had taken more than they had given. They had been blind, too focused on their own survival to notice the quiet plea of the earth beneath their feet. Emma and John spent the next few days preparing. They cleaned out the barn, tended to the animals, and ensured that each creature was well cared for. But it wasn't enough. Emma could feel the weight of the stone in the house, and with it, the pull of something ancient. She knew now that it wasn't enough just to care for the animals or work the land. They had to give something back. But what? It was the morning of the 7th day after the old woman's visit when the answer came to Emma, as if whispered by the wind itself. She stood in the garden, her hands buried deep in the soil as she planted the last row of peas. The air around her was still, but the earth beneath her fingertips seemed to pulse with life. As she worked, she thought back to the way the land had always responded to their care. The way the soil had once been rich and warm beneath her touch. How the trees had once provided shade and the animals had thrived. In that moment, Emma understood. The earth had given them everything it had, and they had taken without thought or gratitude. What they needed to give back was not something physical, but something of themselves, an offering of humility, a promise to live in harmony with the land, to restore the balance they had disrupted. She stood up slowly, wiping the dirt from her hands, and looked out over the fields. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long shadows over the land. It was beautiful, but it was broken. The animals were still sickly, and the earth still felt cold and unyielding. But there was hope. Emma walked slowly toward the barn, where the two-headed duckling had finally begun to move again. It waddled toward her, its strange, two-headed form bobbing in an unsettling rhythm. It stopped in front of her, and for the first time, one of the heads tilted upward to meet her gaze. It wasn't just a simple animal. It was a part of the land itself, a reminder of what had been lost and what needed to be restored. Without thinking, Emma reached down and picked it up, cradling its fragile body in her hands. She didn't know why, but she knew it was time. "John," she called softly, her voice trembling. "I know what we need to do." John appeared in the doorway, his face a mixture of concern and curiosity. "What is it?" Emma held the duckling out to him, her hands shaking. "We need to make an offering. We need to give back to the land what we've taken. The stone. It's part of this, but it's not enough. We need to give our promise, our gratitude." John took the duckling carefully from her, and the two of them stood together in silence, understanding that this was the moment. They couldn't undo the past, but they could move forward with respect, with care for the land and its creatures. It was the only way to restore the balance. They took the stone outside to the center of the farm, where the soil was still rich but heavy, the grass thin and pale. Emma and John knelt side by side, their fingers pressed into the earth. They placed the stone in the center of a small circle they had formed from the garden's flowers and herbs. The air seemed to grow still, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. As they knelt there, Emma felt something shift in the air, a gentle, warm breeze that lifted the hair from her neck. The earth beneath them seemed to stir, and for the first time in days, the land felt alive again. The stone hummed quietly, its energy pulsing in time with the rhythm of the earth. Emma and John stood together, hands clasped, as the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds. The farm was still and quiet, but in that moment, Emma felt the land's forgiveness, its acceptance. The cycle would begin again. The animals, though still sick, would heal. The soil, though strained, would renew itself. They had given back. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the world felt right again. The balance was restored. Emma and John looked out over their farm, the animals beginning to stir, the trees growing green once more. The earth had taken its toll, but it had also given them the chance to make things right. They had been tested and they had passed. Together they would rebuild, not just their farm, but their connection to the land, to each other, and to the life they had taken for granted. And as they stood there, hand in hand, Emma could feel the earth beneath her feet, warm and alive once more, whispering its quiet promise to them. They had made peace, and the land at last was healed.